Okay, so let me welcome everybody to this webinar on Occupy Religion 10 years on. As you all know, if you've joined us today, we're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which started on September 17, 2011. We want to talk about what difference this movement inspires us to make today. My name is Joerg Rieger. I'm director of the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt, and I'm a professor of theology here as well. At the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, we're concerned about matters of economic and ecological justice, always with a concern for the intersectionality of oppressions, including racism and sexism. Let me briefly introduce our topics, then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll enter into a conversation shortly. One of the central insights of the Occupy Wall Street movement continues to be with us, and that is that 99% of us have to work for a living, and that we're spending the bulk of our waking hours at work. That shapes us more deeply than most of us realize, not only economically, but also politically, emotionally, culturally, and religiously. In addition, work is not only the place where many of us experience economic pressure, it's also the place where oppressions along the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality tend to be most pronounced. It might not be unfair to say that everything comes together at work. Even 10 years after its onset, we still owe a debt of gratitude to the Occupy Wall Street movement for bringing back an awareness of the importance of work, labor, and class, issues that had been pushed into the background in the US for decades. But labor and class are not only places where we experience exploitation and oppression. Labor and class are also places where we can form relationships of solidarity and where we're fighting back together. That's happening right now in our country with new intensity. Working people everywhere are on the rise again, receiving community support. I'm thinking of the teachers. They're working people affecting popular culture. I'm thinking of more than 50,000 TV and film workers in Hollywood who just authorized one of the biggest strikes in Hollywood history. The rise of worker co-ops is another example of how the working 99% are gaining ground. And it is the COVID pandemic that has helped us understand why and how working people are essential. What is perhaps most remarkable here is that new forms of solidarity are emerging among the 99%. In our book, Occupy Wall Street, Theology of the Multitude, that Kwok Puilan and I co-authored, we're talking about the notion of deep solidarity. Deep solidarity does not mean that we all need to march in lockstep or talk or think alike. It doesn't mean that our differences along the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality don't matter anymore. It's just the opposite. Deep solidarity means that relations respect difference, not only respect them, but really put them to work productively in the struggle for the common good. Our webinar today picks up all these matters, talking about not so much the past, but really the present and the future. Wondering what role religion might play here, where faith communities are involved and what they could learn. And of course, we'll talk about how the spirit of Occupy remains with us and what's happening now. So let me invite the panelists to come on camera, and I'll introduce each one to you now. In alphabetical order, our first panelist is Aubrey Hendricks, who is a visiting scholar at Columbia University and also at Yale. He's an activist and a public intellectual who is active in politics and the national media. His most recent book is titled Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. This is a brand new book. Congratulations, hot off the press. Next is Nathan Schneider, who is a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. His work touches on many important issues, including his most recent work on religion and worker cooperatives, talking about the cooperative economy. Nathan has also published one of the fundamental books on the Occupy Wall Street movement that was titled Thank You, Anarchy, Notes from the Occupy Apocalypse, which was published in 2013. Then it is my honor to introduce my colleague Kwok Pui Lan, who is the Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She and I co-authored the book, which is the basis for today's discussion, titled Occupy Religion, Theology of the Multitude. She has a forthcoming book she'll mention later, titled Postcolonial Politics and Theology. I'll be the moderator, Joerg Rieger at the Wendland-Cook Program and Vanderbilt Divinity School. Before we start our conversation, let me explain how audience participation will work. We'll have some time at the end for a conversation. There will be at least 10 or a few more minutes for a Q&A at the end. But you can post questions now and at any time during the webinar in the Q&A at the bottom of your page. You can write your own questions, or you can upvote the questions of others that are of interest to you. And we'll go by those questions at the end and probably start with the ones that receive the most votes. So welcome again, everybody. Welcome to the panelists. Let me begin by asking the first question and put it to Nathan Schneider. So Nathan, you wrote the book on the Occupy Wall Street movement. Why did you decide to write it? What was it that you found so important about the movement? And maybe what were 2 or 3 of the most important aspects that caught your attention about Occupy Wall Street?
Thank you. Thanks for the question and the opportunity to be here. I wrote the book as a journalist, so it's really a kind of reassemblage of both scattered scraps of articles and it's from my notebook that I assembled while writing and covering and participating in Occupy Wall Street in New York, as well as a few other places. At the time, I was a reporter who was the first reporter to present myself as such to the planning meetings that led to Occupy Wall Street in August of 2011. And then I stuck around later than most reporters did, following what people did as the protest itself kind of faded away, and people had to figure out how to survive in the economy that they had not utterly transformed. And why did I write? What motivated me to write in that time? One thing was to challenge some of the misunderstandings or the narratives that were out at that time with what I was seeing firsthand. One was that sense in which there was always this ask, what do you want of the system? What do you want of the system, protesters? You know, you've got our attention. Now, what do you want us to change? And over the movement asserted, even against itself, but also against that demand, we are here to create an autonomous space, an experience. We have no one demand of you. Our very presence here is a challenge to your legitimacy. And so that sense of this movement being a presence that said, look, we are not accepting what's on offer by this system, but we are here to rethink what this system should be, or what we really want, was, I think, a really primary something I wanted to make sure we understood about what was going on. And very related to that is a second point, which is the sense in which this was not just a political or economic movement, but also a spiritual one. Of course, when you enter into a space like that, it becomes a spiritual challenge. You're constructing, a new imaginary. And very quickly, I started to notice this as as a spiritual, even at times a religious experience for many of the people involved. And I couldn't avoid that fact for myself. I'm a Roman Catholic Christian, and when I would go day after day or stay overnight at this occupation, I felt like I had a new understanding of, for instance, the book of Acts 2 and 4, why the apostles might share all things in common in a moment of signs and wonders happening around them. And later on, the movement got more explicitly engaged in religion as well. We can talk about that more. But when I talk about, in the title of that book, the Occupy Apocalypse, I mean that in that theological sense, this way in which a movement, a act of defiance and resistance can become a space of revelation where you begin to be able to see what maybe was veiled before.
Thanks, Nathan. And let me just reiterate what you indicated here. This was really written from the inside. You were there, you spent a lot of time there, you engaged. So this is not just a cursory glance from the outside. And thanks for that. It was very inspiring to read your own reflections there. Let me ask the next question of Poilan. You and I co-authored this book on Occupy Wall Street and religion called Occupy Religion. I still vividly remember our meeting in November 2011. This was at an American Academy of Religion, when we decided we would write this book. Why did you feel compelled to do it? And what is it that you have learned by working on that topic, Poilan?
Joerg, thank you very much for inviting me this afternoon to join the conversation, to revisit what we have done 10 years ago and to think ahead what we need to do at the present moment. I was excited about the Occupy movement because some of my students were involved. And so together with some of them, we went to the Occupy site in Boston and watched what was happening. I certainly saw what, Nathan, you have seen too, the kind of excitement that the young people have felt being part of the movement. And as someone who have been involved in various kinds of social movements for gender justice, for domestic violence, so I was also making the connection what this Occupy movement has to do with other social issues that some of us have been participated in. So when at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting, I met Joerg, and Joerg was doing something during that conference on the Occupy movement. I was delighted to have the conversation with Joerg, and then to think about the possibility of co-authoring this book. Because I, coming from an Asian background and as a feminist, and Joerg Rieger, coming from the background of Germany, having been involved in labor justice and class issues, we thought there might be synergy of co-authoring this book together. And before that, we have worked together on other projects. So I was very excited about the opportunity. Two particular things I have learned in that project. Number one, I have not written books like this. That is, I went out to interview those who have participated in the movement, instead of sitting in my own study or in the library doing that kind of research. This collective theologizing excited me. Secondly, I was becoming more aware of the role of religious communities, not just Christian communities, but Buddhist, people who practice pagan spirituality and other forms of traditions, their own involvement, and they also fight for social justice. So I was glad that this book was published as one of the first theological books to talk about Occupy movement. There are also other books that talks about the Bible and Occupy movement and other aspects, but I am delighted to see that it was published soon after, that is in 2012, reflecting on a momentous movement that 900 cities, you have people participated. So I want to underscore, this is not an American Occupy movement. We were at that time observing a global awareness that we as the 99% need to stand up to the 1% against corporate greed and against all those forces that are oppressing us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Prilan. I remember those times when we worked together on the book. We wrote fairly quickly. There wasn't much time, but it was always done in relation to the practical engagement. So it wasn't what theologians often do, spending much time in the library, but really spending time with the movements. And it was great to be working on this together. So thank you. So Aubrey, let me turn the next question to you. You were also, I guess, in New York City at the time, and I'm wondering, what is it that struck you most about the Occupy Wall Street movement from the perspective of somebody who has always been both a scholar of religion and an activist?
Thank you, Joerg, and pardon me, thank you for convening this important discussion, and thank the three of you for your important books. I've learned a lot and been inspired a lot by reading them. I visited Occupy Wall Street, Action Wall Street with Jesse Jackson, and I got a chance to interact with a number of the young people there. As a biblical scholar, what struck me though was first the prophetic dimension of this occupation. I mean, it was to expose corruption and economic exploitation in a systemic way, which we see that kind of excoriation and by Amos, for instance, and Micah, biblical prophets. But what really struck me was that it reminded me of the so-called Jesus' cleansing of the temple, which was really a planned demonstration, as we know. And he went to the seat of power. But more than that, Mark tells us that Jesus occupied the temple in that it says it didn't allow anyone to walk across the temple grounds. Temple grounds were 33 square acres. And so clearly he wasn't in it just by himself. And so it really reminded me of this demonstration of Jesus at the temple. And in that way it was very inspiring, also because most of those, following Jesus were young people anyway. I mean, by definition and the demographic necessity. So that's what I really drew from it. And it cast the biblical narrative in a different and much more useful form that we could use that as a basis for movement for people of biblical faith.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all three of you. This was the first round of conversation here, thinking about what happened back then, thinking about how this impressed us. And I think there's a lot that shaped us that's still with us, even though the conversation maybe has moved on a bit. In a second round of questioning, I want to talk a little bit more about the religious aspects of the movement. So Prilan, when we wrote the Occupy Religion book, the subtitle was Theology of the Multitude. So we really wanted to talk theology, not just religious ideas, but maybe revisiting, re-envisioning theology. What of that theological perspective do you think is still relevant 10 years later?
I think that it is still very relevant. Let me just share some of the thought behind the articulation of a theology of multitude. Because at that time, we were witnessing not only the multitude in the United States rising up, but as I said, the multitude were rising up in other parts of the world. Joerg and I were also very influenced by the book Multitude by Hart and Negri. And the articulation was the multitude is not just a loose group of people, a cloud. The multitude actually has subjectivity. That multitude book really talks about the mass as political subject. And we were also influenced by liberation theology, talking about people as subject of history. And from my own Asian background, I recall Minjung theology, that is the people's theology from Korea. I was talking about oplos, that is the cloud around Jesus. That is why we use this term, multitude, to capture the excitement of that time. And since then, that is the Occupy movement, and we have seen many other forms of protest. Certainly from my own background as coming from the former British colony of Hong Kong, we have the umbrella movement or the occupied Hong Kong movement. And just last several years, we have seen different kinds of social protest from India, Algeria, Colombo, and Spain, and France, and Myanmar, Thailand, and of course, Hong Kong in the last 2 years. And so the multitude kept increasing. So the relevance is still there today. But I think we need to deepen our understanding of what is the theological symbols and articulations from this vast multitude. I think the world is becoming more and more not habitable for many people. We are talking about the Haitian people risking their lives to cross the border, and we are talking about the Afghans, and we are talking about people in Africa, many migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. So the world is becoming a very inhospitable space for the multitude. And the cries of the multitude must be heard by theologians, by people of faith. And then we need to come up with our own adequate responses and social action and new religious leadership. This theology of the multitude needs to be deepened, elaborated, and intensified.
Thank you, Puilan. What's really important here is how it all comes together. I mean, there's liberation theology traditions, there's theoretical approaches, and there's really biblical and deeply ancient Christian traditions that also matter here. You know, Jesus's own encounters with a multitude. And maybe the recognition that there's more of us than them. You know, oftentimes progressives think of themselves as doing minority politics. The reality is we are the 99%, is saying there's a large number of people, not only who are affected, but who are also becoming agents and who are ready and already engaged in making a difference. That's a theological point here as well. Let me pose the second question to Aubrey. When you think of the religious engagement in Occupy Wall Street, what is it that is of the biggest interest to you? I'm thinking specifically now also in the connection to African American religious traditions on which you have been working and in which you are immersed. And what might be the religious relevance of Occupy Wall Street in that context?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, so interesting that Occupy Wall Street really presented, I guess we call an implicit critique to libertarianism and radical individualism, because what we saw was a community forum. It was a focus on community, on the common good, much greater, and what that has in common with Black religious traditions is this communitarian focus, because the focus of the biblical tradition, of course, we know is on the common good. And we see that throughout the Hebrew Bible, and we see that in the teachings of Jesus as well. And the churches seem to have forgotten that, lost sight of that particular in this late form of capitalism. So I see that. I see the similarities there, but what that also offers for the Black church, I think, is a model of activism that seems to have sort of elided in the last decades. There seems to have evolved a lack of empowerment in relative terms. So I can see that what this did, because many churches, Black churches, showed up. You know, they chartered buses and they came to Occupy, and it focused, I think, the churches more on systemic injustice than we see normally. I see normally talked about in Black churches, and again, it offers a model of activism that seems to have been sort of lost since the civil rights era. I mean, there have been exceptions, of course, but it's a model of activism that hasn't really been followed through. But we saw that the Occupy movement inspired that again. Unfortunately, we have not seen a lot of continuity with this, but it's something that should be brought up again and re-embraced for the Black church to become much more concerned with systemic justice, institutional injustice, rather than just individual salvation, which is, of course, what Black churches have in common with, what many Black churches have in common with mainstream Christianity. So Occupy is an indictment of the lack of vision in churches writ large, recognizing the importance of us struggling for the common good, which has, of course, implications for democratic socialist sensibilities.
I can definitely confirm that also for white Christianity, where I spent my life, you know, between Europe and the US, where you know, this idea of individualism, which is never the reality, right? We're always connected. Capitalism connects us in all kinds of ways, not only good but also bad. The idea of individualism is usually the myth of the powerful that tell themselves we have made it all by ourselves, covering up the fact that we're all connected. And then, of course, there's no way that you can respond together and that you can come up with alternatives. So the fact that you saw this happening is really impressive to me, because that's also what I think needs to happen in our own time, across certainly the borders of Christianity, but also other religions in the world. So thank you, Overy. Nathan, you've already mentioned that you are, you know, not only a journalist and a media studies professor, but you're also working as a person of faith. You have written a book on perceptions of God. You're looking at co-ops now and Roman Catholic social teachings. So what is it that you're making of the connections of religion and Occupy, and what does that mean today?
Well, I shared that sense of a kind of wake-up call that Overy just talked about, that you know, there was this demand that has really stuck with me especially after the occupation in New York was driven out by a violent police attack in November of 2011. That at that point, activists started turning much more toward churches and made this call, this demand that I kind of summarize as church act like a church. You know, a lot of these people were unchurched and we're coming to these churches and saying, you know, wake up. You know, like, aren't churches supposed to be places that support, you know, like calls for justice for the poor, right? And that was you know, a demand that, you know, a lot of leaders of churches aren't used to getting. On the one hand, a good group of religious leaders in New York City and elsewhere organized to kind of meet that need to step up. You know, for a while I had as the background of my phone a scene from a church in my neighborhood, an Episcopalian church, St. Luke and St. Matthew in Brooklyn, that was filled with boxes because it was full of supplies going out to relief efforts organized by Occupy Sandy in late 2012. And that it was such a beautiful sacramental space to see that church transform. You know, my own church just 2 blocks away did not do that, but it was powerful to see some of them step up and to reclaim that kind of Book of Acts sensibility of being ready to turn over your life, turn over your community to this call. I also want to just amplify a couple things others have said. Puilang talked about this as a global movement. That was very evident to me when I first arrived at the first planning meeting. There were people with networks from all around the world, and they really saw this less as founding an American movement and more as joining the global movement that was already underway in 2011. And that's something that a lot of Americans have trouble seeing for ourselves, because we like to think we invented everything. But this is absolutely critical to understand about what the ground level perception of what was going on was. And also I want to touch on race here. Many of the participants who came in, thinking of this as just about Wall Street, just about what was going on in the United States, and who came in with that kind of stain of whiteness, did not see the connection between American capitalism and inequality and racial capitalism, racial inequality. So for instance, a really critical moment happened with the execution of Troy Davis in Georgia early in Occupy Wall Street, where many people, there were those who saw the connection between this execution of this, very likely innocent man and this protest on Wall Street. And many others said, wait, we're here to protest Wall Street, not this. By the end, the experience of police assaults, which were new to many white participants, had transformed their understanding. And in many ways, I think prefigured the ability for many white people to then step into Black Lives Matter. And in many respects, Occupy kind of had to die in order to, it kind of worked itself to its own death, because I think many people by 6 months on started to recognize the limitations of the frame that the movement had established for itself. Occupy. Do we really need more occupation in the Americas? This kind of race blindness that was part of the initial frame of the 99%. And so many people left recognizing that this frame isn't enough. We need something bigger, and Black Lives Matter and more that followed, Standing Rock, enabled people to enter into movements that followed on Occupy, but actually really critiqued it in their own frames around centering race, centering indigeneity, and decolonialization.
Thank you, Nathan. You've already touched on issues I want to touch on in this last round of conversation, namely this whole question of intersectionality. How do questions of class, economics, exploitation come together with questions of, struggles along the lines of race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. That's crucial, I think, for the work that we're all doing. Maybe one more comment on the religious component here. In the Protestant world, we often talk about revivals, we talk about awakenings, and so on. When I hear you talk, all three of you, there seems to be some sort of an awakening going on, except in an unexpected place, and not what people usually think it is. And so maybe there's a movement of the spirit here in a way that is still very relevant, because it broadens. It's something that doesn't get just defined by one movement, by one issue, but much more broadly. Before we go to the last round of questions, let me mention, I was just informed that we cannot upvote questions today. There may be a technical glitch here. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. So now for maybe about 2 minutes each panelist, the last round. First question here to Aubrey. Occupy Wall Street, as I think I've already said, made us aware of the realities of social class in the United States. The battle cry, we are the 99%, affirms the solidarity of class at one level. But of course, that was one of the critiques of the movement as well, right? That maybe it was too narrowly focused on class. And so I'm wondering, in your own thinking, was that the case? Or how could it be broadened? I mean, what is the broader message here? How does this reawakening of the notion of class come together with so many other struggles that have shaped America?
Yeah. Well, as we know, the Occupy movement it started with an egalitarian impulse, right? And they were very intentional about a lack of hierarchy, and such that there was no real leadership. And when you remember how when you spoke, it was echoed throughout the crowd. So there was no one main speaker. That was very important. But I think that the focus on class did miss it did miss an opportunity to talk more about the reality of race and how it is racism is not just endemic to this nation from its very founding, but endemic, of course, to capitalism as well, an important tool of capitalism. So when we talk about 99%, the 99%, what often seemed to be left out was the fact that a significant percentage of that 99% had another burden in addition to class, and that was racism. Critical race theory has brought a lot of those contradictions out, and there have been some important books recently. Keeanga Yamada Taylor's book on Black Lives Matter has really pointed out the extent of the breadth and the depth of racism and white supremacy as it pervades everything in America. But that was not really brought out to a great extent. And so the lethality of racism just really wasn't talked about. Now, a lot of that had to do with the fact that those who experienced racism, there was not a big surge of Black people that I witnessed at the Occupy Wall Street. A lot of them saw it as a white thing, a white hippie thing, and so Blacks have to take some responsibility too for that not being discussed. But I think that there were some opportunities lost. I think today would be different. If Occupy Wall Street happened today, it would be different because of the space that it opened up for Black Lives Matter and some of the activism that came afterward. But at the time, for all the good that it did, it really missed out on a real dimension of horror in the American experience, and that is the white supremacist oppression and attempts at dehumanization of people of African descent in America.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just a quick note here to highlight the book by Keeanga Yamada Taylor that you mentioned. I believe the title is From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. What really strikes me as interesting in her book is that she is arguing for the issue of solidarity. And I think that was a message of Occupy Wall Street, because she says ultimately, the majority, of course, of Black Americans and white Americans are not benefiting from this system. And this is something that actually can weld people together if we don't let various of the other structures separate you, if we resist the divide and the conquer that are so typical in our own time. And so to bring these issues together, I think all of us would be agreed, is part not only of the next step, but of any successful resistance movement that has to be genuinely intersectional.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that, Aubrey. I'm looking at the time here, and we already have a few questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll go to Nathan next, and then to Puilan at the end. Nathan, in your own work, recently you have written about the cooperative economy and worker co-ops in particular. It seems to me there is a connection to concerns raised by Occupy Wall Street. And I'm sure this is something that's been on your mind, also sort of progressing from or moving between these various projects. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because this seems to be another way of picking up that heritage.
Yeah, for me, the connection autobiographically was direct. I started reporting on the cooperative movement precisely because some of the activists I was following from Occupy went into it, and they were trying to figure out, how do we live in this capitalism, but carry with us the values of that we had shaped together in the occupations. And the cooperative movement, much more ancient than this, and in its modern form, as old as the public capitalist corporation, was something that they saw as an opportunity. And people who were involved in Occupy have been involved in now, in the years since, building a new generation of the cooperative movement, which I covered in my most recent book, Everything for Everyone. And that is, I think, a crucial retrieval, a recognition that if we are to live, by democratic values in this economy, we need traditions like this. And it was powerful to see them go back to a tradition older, to have available to them a tradition that they could draw on, to build on. And it also points to a broader legacy of that movement, of the Occupy movement, that I think we need to remember today. But there's a lot of emphasis in the last few years, particularly under the Trump presidency and the global situation, of a kind of erosion of democracy going on right now. And in that context, I think it's important to remember the kind of obsession, the kind of like crazy eyes people had toward democracy in the context of 2011 around the world. This moment of tremendous democratic optimism. People, Aubrey mentioned the people's mic, the way in which people amplify each other's voices. This was just one example of all the ways in which activists in this time were trying to reinvent democracy for the 21st century with digital tools, with public practice. There was this sense that democracy is a living tradition that could be revolutionized, that could be made alive again. Today, much more, I think people are anxious to just protect the 18th century institutions that exist. And that's, I think, a really dangerous retreat. I hope that if you take nothing else from that moment, that global uprising of 10 years ago, it's to hold on to that sense that we need democracy to advance. We need to advance our practice of democracy if it is to stay alive, creatively, intensively, rather than simply think that our job is to protect, reinforce, and defend.
Thank you, Nathan. I think there is a component here that's oftentimes overlooked when people think about movements just as resistance movements. There's really an enormous amount of building going on also. So it's not just protesting, but it's also building new kinds of relationships, building a new economy that's part of the worker co-ops and the cooperative economy, building power. We often talk about political democracy, but we also need to talk about economic democracy. Is there democratic relationships, at work, at the sort of things that keep us occupied for most of our waking hours? And so putting together these various pieces, and of course, is there religious democracy, I would add, for people of various faiths? What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we build together? So this leads me to the final question to Kwok Pui Lan. When you think about this whole Occupy Wall Street movement and the religious component, how do you think theology can contribute to the discussion of these current topics that we're talking about, economic, political, ecological, and so on? What do you think, as a theologian, is the difference that theology could make?
Thank you. As I was pondering this question, I was also paying attention to some of the questions raised in the Q&A. I will try to briefly also touch on some of the things that our colleagues have asked. Was Occupy movement successful? Well, it depends on how you define success. I happen to come from a civilization that has thousands of years of history. And then I understand that no one single incident will have the power to change consciousness or institutions. Changes that are so radical sometimes is very difficult and maybe violent too. And that is why I think this touches on theology of hope, where hope comes in. And also, obviously, many of us are very familiar with Judith Butler's theory, the performative aspects of politics. That is, one of the person asked, how can we build continuing structure if the movement seems to be folded, okay? Or after the campsites were forcibly evicted. Well, I think we need to look at politics in a more dialectical ways. Sometimes there needs to be continuing structures. Sometimes we have to value the performative aspect of people gathering together, claiming power, subverting democracy, because they argue for democracy. Later, you wrote a book, talk about anarchy. And in our Occupy book, we talk about the starfish analogy, isn't it? That is, politics should not be conceived as only party politics. Only one kind of organizing will work. The world is too complex. For me, the hope, if we talk about theology of hope, that hope is really a contingent upon our praxis. And through that praxis, radical imagination of society will happen. In that sense, the Occupy movement really stirs up for us to think, at least for me as a theologian, to even imagine a church without walls. What will it look like? What will be the liturgies? And what will be the authors? Because I saw those authors at the campsite, interreligious, very colorful, very vibrant, very life-giving, shall I say. And I think in the last 10 years, I have paid more attention to shifting political theology from the North Atlantic to Asian Pacific because of the pivot to Asia. Remember President Obama said that? Today, when we talk about the issues facing the world, whether it's economic, politics, or ecology, if we are not talking about Sino-American Empire, I link them together, that we are missing the signs of our time. That is why I have collected some of my essays published in the last years for this new book, Post-Colonial Politics and Theology. Post-colonial studies should not be just about text, isn't it? We need to be talking about political situation, what are some of the new possibilities for humankind and the planet. And hopefully that new book will make some small contribution to our conversation.
Thank you, Puilan. This brings us to our last round in which we can address some of the questions that were raised in the Q&A, and we've also had a lively conversation in the chat. So thanks for everybody thanks to everybody for contributing. Maybe combining two of the questions here in the Q&A, and then let me suggest that Nathan, if you go first, Puilan second, then Aubrey, and then we can conclude. And each of you, I'm curious what your responses would be. So one question is about whether we might see a resurgence of the spirit of the Occupy movement in this area of intersection of climate change and other abuses that are going on. And maybe combine that with this other question that Puilan just mentioned, this question of, how do we continue? How do we build continuity? So on the one hand, what about the movement of the spirit? Is it moving again? And how do we build that into sort of an ongoing movement, maybe ongoing structures even, that would sustain us for the years to come? So Nathan, let me put that to you first.
Thank you. I think here's where I'd bring up media. I think one of the real weaknesses of this movement was its reliance on a kind of meme, a hashtag Occupy Wall Street. When the occupation space was gone, that digital presence that was so powerful in spreading the message was not a tremendously powerful tool in sustaining a movement, both sustainable for the individuals involved emotionally, spiritually, and also collectively. It was draining. And I think this is, places a call on us, I think, to rethink the kind of architecture of our movements and be very careful about relying as we build going forward on these kind of shiny new tools that ultimately are not for these kinds of movements. And one thing that's been really exciting to see is people building their own tools, their own infrastructures to support future movements. And religious traditions have really were a model of that, a reminder that these, building the tools for long-term work require long-term care, require some kind of old practices of communal life.
Thank you, Nathan. Puilan.
Many people are asking, when are we going back to the normal because of the pandemic? Well, from the Chinese medical point of view, if you have a virus or if you feel sick, that is really a kairos moment or an opportunity to then stop what you are doing, right? Take rest, take a pause, and then see in what way you can strengthen yourself or from that illness. This pandemic is absolutely a wake-up call. Isn't it not a wake-up call? And for us who belongs to the Christian tradition, who are members of different faiths, we need to really search deep down. What are the spiritual resources to meet the crisis of humankind? 700,000 people in the United States, one country alone, died in less than 2 years, isn't it? If it is not waking us up, when will we be woken up? And that is why I hope that spirit of the Occupy movement, self-organizing, using whatever means, face-to-face organizing or through the media or whatever, that this is an opportunity for us to say prophetically that in our deep spiritual resources, we have something to offer for justice, for hope, for saving the planet and ourselves. And I certainly hope the Spirit will be among us once again. We need her to speak, to stir in our chaotic situation.
Thank you, Puilan. That was such a helpful reminder and powerful in really bringing us together. Aubrey, you will have the last word for the panelists, and then I'll have the last word as the moderator.
Could you restate the question in brief again, please?
So it's really two pieces. One is, where do you see the Spirit moving here? And the other part of that, how would that help us to build sustainable communities, something that's lasting and that keeps us going?
Yeah. Well, I'm with Puilan, but in spirit, but in optimism, put it that way. But I think the jury is out. It's still out on that. The Occupy Wall Street movement was wonderful, but it didn't resonate. There were a number of publics that it didn't resonate with, particularly Black people. Didn't resonate with, and the fact Occupy Wall Street, many folk didn't see themselves as, they didn't understand what that what that was about was that that it was really a critique, a systemic critique, an institutional critique of institutional oppression. So I don't know about the spirit of Occupy Wall Street that has survived. I don't know. I don't know that there's, the jury's out for me on that, I'll be honest with you. In terms of the spirit that's moving, I think if there's been any benefit from the very evil regime that was just kicked out of office, is that it has awakened many people to, and it really has cast this beyond a political notion and really to onto moral ground. I mean, it's helped us use the term evil again, because we stopped calling things evil that were evil. And I think in that sense, and with these young people who are waking up, I think this is a very, very important moment, but an extremely dangerous moment. And I don't know that we are yet awakened to the point to see the extreme danger of it. And so I'm waiting to see. I'm hopeful, but I'm waiting to see, you know, what happens here. I mean, I'm doing my part as much as I can, but you know, I mean, the evil that we are facing is so overwhelming, and our response from the left is so underwhelming, and certainly from the religious community is so underwhelming, that I don't know that we've mobilized the resources yet to push back on in this terrible time. I'm hopeful, but I don't know that that's the case.
And thank you for this word of caution, Aubrey. I think it's important not to overestimate necessarily what we can do, but also to see what has been done. There's one more question we cannot get to now about interreligious solidarity. And I think this is something else that we've seen in Occupy. There's been various forms of Christianity, but many other religions, Puilan mentioned Buddhism, there was a Jewish presence, there was a Muslim presence. Engaged Buddhism is something, that people certainly are learning about, and engaged religion in general, I think we have to talk more about. And keep in mind, what is often forgotten is that Occupy became dangerous enough that it had to be destroyed. It did not just fizzle and fade away. It was growing, it was vital, it had its problems, but in the end, they kicked it out, and that's the other part of the story, I think, that we have to keep in mind. How do we make sure our movements, once they become successful, do not get destroyed again? I think divide and conquer here is oftentimes a problem, and we'll have to keep that in our mind as well. So our conversation today, in conclusion, certainly marks an anniversary of something that happened in the past, but more importantly, it reminds us of what's still going on and of the work that needs to be done now. For that, I think it's clear that we cannot do that abstractly. Academics sometimes talk about theory, perhaps too much, but it all starts and goes back to our local communities. All our panelists are engaged in various places in their communities. I know our attendees in the webinar are also, and so let me encourage you to join the work that's going on in your communities, continue the engagement of matters of religion and justice. This is the work that we're trying to do here at the Wendland-Cook Program at Vanderbilt. You can check us out at www.religionandjustice.org. You can sign up for our email list. You can like us on Facebook. But more importantly, stay connected where you are, and let's think about how this broader, deep solidarity is forming up, and how we can work together so that this movement of the 99% ultimately bears fruit, and that I believe it will keep changing the world as it already has in so many ways. So thanks, everybody. Thanks especially to our panelists, Professors Kwok Puilan, Nathan Schneider, and Aubrey Hendricks. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I always enjoy talking to you and spending time with you. I'd love to spend more time, but our webinars are usually limited to an hour to also respect everybody's time. So thank you, goodbye, and let's all stay in touch and see where the Spirit is moving us next. Thank you.